A man lost 4 hours of his life after hearing a woman whisper his name. A stranger was caught digging something in the woods at midnight. And a priest walked out of a child's room without finishing the blessing. These are true horror stories. This story makes me sound unreliable, and I've never liked that feeling. I live in a small town where people remember what kind of car you drive and what time you usually get home from work. And once something strange gets attached to your name, it doesn't really wash off. Back when this happened, I was 32, living alone in a rental. I worked at a packaging warehouse, and my life was steady in a way that probably sounds dull. I didn't go out much in the winter. It gets dark early here, and the cold settles into the walls, especially in older houses like mine. The house, one floor, low ceilings, narrow hallway that led from the living room to 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. The kitchen sat off to the side with a back door that opened into a yard that didn't have a proper fence. I always meant to fix that. The heating was old but functional, and sometimes it made a ticking sound after it shut off, like it was cooling down in stages. At the time I thought maybe that noise had something to do with what happened, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The living room had one big front window facing the street, and at night I kept the blinds half down, not fully closed. It was January, cold enough that the air felt dry inside even with the heat running. That night, I came home around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, microwaved leftovers, watched some television I can't even remember now, and texted my sister or something. Nothing strange, no bad mood, no headache. I didn't drink. I should say that because people always ask. I don't drink during the week, and that night I hadn't had anything except coffee and water. Around 9 o'clock I turned off the TV and washed my plate. It's always quiet in winter. Even the dogs in the neighborhood don't bark as much. The smell, it was something sweet but not sugary sweet like cookies. It was more like perfume but softer, almost warm. If I had to compare it, I'd say it reminded me of those old-fashioned powders my grandmother used to keep in her bathroom cabinet, but fresher. It drifted into the kitchen slowly, or at least that's how I remember it. I didn't panic. I actually smiled a little because it was pleasant. I thought one of the neighbors was burning some kind of candle, and the scent was coming through the vents, even though that doesn't make much sense because the houses aren't that close together. I stood there for a minute just breathing it in. Then I heard something that I still struggle to describe without sounding crazy. It wasn't like someone shouting from another room. It was more like the suggestion of a voice close to my ear, but not inside my head. I don't mean that in a mental way. I mean it sounded external but very near. A woman's voice, soft, like she was mid-conversation, and I had just walked into the room halfway through. I couldn't make out full sentences. I caught pieces, or maybe I only think I did. It felt like someone saying my name in a tone that wasn't urgent but familiar. I don't even know if it was my name now. At the time I was sure it was. I turned around immediately. The kitchen was empty. The smell seemed stronger, like it had followed me when I moved. I walked down the hallway slowly, which is not something I would normally do. I'm not the type to creep around my own house. I flipped on the bedroom lights one by one. Nothing was out of place. Windows closed, doors locked. I checked the bathroom, even opened the shower curtain, which I never do unless I'm actually going to shower. The voice didn't repeat itself clearly, but there was this low murmur, like someone talking in the next room with the door shut. I was feeling confused more than scared. I kept thinking there had to be a practical explanation. Maybe the TV had turned itself back on. Maybe my phone was playing something. I checked both. TV off. Phone silent on the coffee table. The smell was everywhere by then. It filled the living room in a way that felt deliberate, which I know sounds like I'm assigning intention to it, and I'm not trying to. I just mean it wasn't faint anymore. It was strong enough that I could almost taste it. The next part is where things stop lining up in a way that makes sense. I remember grabbing my car keys from the small dish by the door. I remember thinking that I needed to step outside and get some fresh air. That's all. I didn't feel compelled. I didn't feel forced. I just felt like the air inside the house was too thick. I put on my coat. I didn't put on gloves, which is odd because it was below freezing, and I'm usually careful about that. I don't remember locking the door behind me, but apparently I did because when my sister checked later, it was locked. After that, there is nothing. No memory of walking to my car. No memory of starting it. No memory of driving. It's not blurry. It's just absent. like a section of tape that was cut cleanly out. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes and seeing trees through my windshield. It was still dark, but the angle of the street lights was different. My car was parked on the shoulder of Route 17, right where the highway curves near the woods. The engine was off. The keys were in the ignition but turned back. My seatbelt was still on. I was slumped slightly to the side and my first clear sensation was the cold. The inside of the car felt like a freezer. My breath fogged immediately when I exhaled. My nose was wet. I wiped it with the back of my hand and saw blood. It had dried in a thin line down to my lip. I tasted metal. I didn't feel like I had been hit. My head didn't ache in a sharp way. It was more like pressure behind my eyes. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It was 1:17 a.m. When I left my house it was around 9:30. 4 hours, give or take. There were headlights behind me. A state trooper's car. Apparently, someone had called in a vehicle parked oddly on the shoulder. I don't remember the officer's name, but I remember he kept his voice even, like he was trying not to startle me. He asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. He asked if I'd hit my head. I said I didn't think so. I told him the truth, which was that I had no idea how I got there. I could see in his face that he thought I was either lying or confused in a way that might turn into a bigger problem. They took me to the hospital as a precaution. My blood sugar was normal. No alcohol in my system. No drugs. CT scan came back clear. The nosebleed had stopped on its own, and the doctor said sometimes cold air can trigger that, especially if the lining is dry. He suggested maybe I'd had a brief fainting spell or some kind of transient episode. I remember him using the word episode like it was a catch-all. When my sister picked me up from the hospital, she kept looking at me like she was trying to find something different about my face. I didn't feel different. I felt embarrassed. I kept apologizing for scaring her. She asked why I had driven all the way out there in the middle of the night. I told her about the smell and the voice, and even as I said it, I heard how it sounded. She didn't dismiss me. She nodded and said, maybe stress can do strange things. The police checked the area where my car had been parked. No signs of anyone else around. No footprints in the snow near my doors except my own from when I got out after waking up. The woods were untouched, just a thin layer of snow reflecting the headlights. People in town talked about it for a week or two. Some said I'd sleepwalked even though I've never done that in my life. Hinted at seizures, you know. I had follow-up tests done. Am I normal? The neurologist told me sometimes the brain misfires in ways we don't fully understand. I went back to the house a few days later. I stood in the kitchen where it had started. I half expected the smell to come back. Like it had been waiting for me. It didn't. The house felt ordinary again. I checked under the sink for leaks or chemicals that might have caused some kind of reaction. Even asked my neighbors if they had burned candles or done anything unusual that night. They hadn't smelled anything strange. What bothers me isn't just the missing time. It's the calmness I felt before I left. I didn't panic. I wasn't confused. I felt almost invited, I guess. That's not the right word, but it's close. Like I had been gently directed somewhere. And I don't like saying that because it suggests something intentional, and I don't have proof of that. I try to stick to facts. In fact, I smelled something sweet that had no clear source. In fact, I heard a voice I couldn't identify. In fact, I ended up parked near the woods with 4 hours missing and a nosebleed. It's been 5 years now. I've never had another blackout. I don't know what happened in those 4 hours. No one found an explanation that fit cleanly. I should explain the place first because the cabin wasn't somewhere far away or deep in the wilderness like people imagine when they hear that word. It was actually only about 20 minutes outside the town where I grew up. There are scattered houses and some hunting properties. But once you get a little deeper down those gravel roads, you can go long stretches without seeing anyone. That cabin belonged to my uncle for years, and after he moved out of state, the family sort of shared it. People used it for hunting season or sometimes just to get away for a weekend. I had been there a bunch of times growing up, mostly during the day, but that particular night I was alone. I want to say I was like 23 or 24 then, around that time anyway. I had just gotten back to town after working out of state for a while, and a friend had mentioned going up there to relax sometime. He ended up backing out at the last minute because of work, but I already had the key and figured I'd go anyway. I'm not really the type who gets nervous being out in the woods by myself. Where I grew up, that was normal. I got there in the early evening and the drive was exactly how I remembered it. Occasional clearings where people had cut wood years ago. The cabin sat in a small open patch with trees wrapping around it on 3 sides, and the dirt driveway curving in front. I unlocked the door, brought in a cooler and a small bag, and did the usual stuff people do when they arrive somewhere after dark is coming. Checked the lights, made sure the generator switch worked, and opened a couple windows because the inside smelled a little stale from not being used for a while. For a few hours I sat on the porch for a bit, watched the sky go dark, and listened to insects and frogs from the marshy area down the hill. At one point, I heated up something quick on the stove and ate inside because mosquitoes were starting to get annoying. It was actually quieter than I expected. I had stepped outside with a flashlight because I forgot something in my truck. The cabin doesn't have outdoor lights except the one above the door, and that one has always been dim, so I usually bring a small torch with me. As I walked down the short path toward the driveway, I heard what sounded like metal scraping dirt. At least that's the closest thing I can compare it to now. Like someone pushing something into the ground over and over. The thing about that cabin lot is there's a big oak tree like 30 yards from the porch, slightly downhill toward the woods. It's been there forever. And kinda stands by itself because the rest of the trees cluster farther back. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I wasn't sure if I should even look. That probably sounds strange, but when you're in a quiet place at night and suddenly realize another person might be out there, it catches you off guard. Eventually curiosity got the better of me and I raised the light. I only saw movement. Then the beam caught a figure crouched near the base of that oak tree. There was a man there digging into the ground with what looked like a shovel or maybe a short spade. I couldn't see the tool, but I could hear the metal hitting dirt every few seconds. The strange part was he wasn't using a proper light. He had a phone on the ground next to him with the flashlight turned on. The screen was facing up, so it was shining sideways across the soil. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The guy wasn't wearing a shirt. It was late enough that the temperature had dropped a little and most people wouldn't be out there like that. He was also digging in a way that looked rushed, almost frantic. Without really thinking about it, I lifted my flashlight and pointed it straight at him. The beam hit his back and shoulders and he froze immediately. The sudden movement made the phone on the ground shift and cast this weird sideways shadow across the hole he had been digging. I remember seeing how pale his skin looked in the light. But also that his hands and forearms looked darker, like they were covered in dirt or something else. It's hard to say now because everything happened quickly, but there was definitely something smeared across his hands. I realized he knew someone was there. Then he ran. It was sudden and fast, straight into the darker tree line behind the oak. He didn't even grab the phone at first. I actually remember the phone light staying on the ground for a moment after he disappeared, still shining across the dirt. A couple seconds later he rushed back, snatched it up, and vanished into the woods again. The entire thing probably lasted less than 10 seconds. My brain kept trying to figure out what I had just seen. One thing I did notice clearly when the light hit him was that his hands looked wet or darkened in patches. At the time I thought it might be blood, though I can't say that with certainty. It could have been mud, but something about it didn't look like normal dirt. After a while I slowly walked toward the tree. Part of me was telling myself not to do that, but curiosity kept pushing me forward. The ground near the base of the oak had been disturbed pretty heavily. There was a long hole in the dirt, bigger than I first thought when I saw it from a distance. Up close, it looked roughly the length of a person lying down, maybe a little longer, and narrow enough that the comparison crept into my mind whether I wanted it to or not. The soil around it was piled in loose clumps like someone had been working quickly. I shined my light down into it and remembered thinking it seemed deeper than I expected, though I didn't measure it or anything. Nothing inside caught my eye right away, just dirt walls and darker soil near the bottom. Standing there beside that half-dug hole gave me a strange feeling I can't explain very well. It wasn't just the fact someone had been digging on the property. It was the way he ran and how he had been working there alone in the dark with only a phone light. Something about that felt secretive. Like whatever he was doing wasn't meant to be seen. I decided pretty quickly that I didn't want to stay outside anymore. I walked back toward the cabin, went inside, and locked the door behind me. Then I locked the back door too, even though I usually didn't bother with that when I was alone out there. I remember double-checking the windows as well. For the next hour or so, I tried to distract myself by watching something on my phone and eating the rest of the food I brought. But I kept catching myself listening for sounds outside. Eventually things got quiet again. Around midnight, maybe a little after, I had turned off most of the lights and was sitting near the small table by the window. And I saw something outside. A shape stopped directly in front of the glass. Someone was standing there. The cabin windows aren't huge, but they're low enough that if someone stands close, they're almost face level with whoever is inside. I couldn't see his features because the outside was darker than the room, but I could make out the outline of a head, also shoulders. The person leaned slightly forward as if trying to look through the glass. I stayed completely still. My phone screen dimmed in my hand because I had stopped touching it, and suddenly the room got darker. For several seconds the figure didn't move. It just remained there, close enough that I knew the person could probably see inside if the light hit the right angle. I didn't recognize the face. Actually, I never saw the face clearly at all. After that, the figure stepped away from the window and I heard footsteps on the porch boards. The sound moved slowly toward the front door. The handle rattled. They just tested the handle like someone checking whether it was locked. My chest felt tight at that point because it became obvious this wasn't someone who accidentally wandered up there. The footsteps moved away from the door and circled around the side of the cabin. I could hear gravel crunching outside and then the faint sound of someone near the back door. That handle moved too, like they were testing it carefully. I kept my eyes on the floor because I didn't want my silhouette showing in the windows. For several minutes the person walked around the cabin. The boards creaked occasionally and once I heard something brush against the wall near the corner. Then the sounds gradually faded toward the trees again. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Every once in a while I thought I heard distant movement outside, though it might have been animals. When morning finally started to lighten the windows, I felt relieved enough to start packing my things. I didn't bother cooking breakfast or anything like that. Before driving away I walked over to the oak tree again. The hole was still there. It looked mostly the same as the night before, though some loose dirt had been pushed partially back into it, like someone had started filling it and then stopped. The shape was uneven, almost like whoever did it had given up halfway through. I shined my flashlight inside again, even though daylight was coming through the trees by then. Nothing inside caught my attention, just disturbed ground. The whole situation felt unfinished, like there was a piece missing that I couldn't place. Eventually I got in the truck and left. I told a couple family members about it later and they suggested maybe it was a hunter burying animal remains or something similar. But that explanation never quite sat right with me, mostly because of how he acted when the light hit him and how he came back to the cabin after midnight. I was 16 when all of this happened and my sister Elena was younger. So, there's an age gap there that probably matters in how I remember it. We were living in a 2-story house. My dad worked and my mom stayed home most of the time, though she did tailoring work for neighbors. We had been in that house for about 3 years by then, and nothing dramatic had ever happened before this. It wasn't old in a haunted-looking way or anything like that. Just beige walls, tiled floors downstairs, 3 bedrooms upstairs, a hallway. That hallway always felt darker than it should have been, even in the daytime. I'm not saying that because of what happened later. I remember thinking that about the hallway long before. Dad left at 6:30 every morning and came back around 5 o'clock. Mom would make breakfast, then clean or sew, and I'd walk Elena to the bus stop before catching mine from the next corner. Elena was small for her age and quiet. She liked drawing animals with huge eyes, and she slept with the same faded yellow blanket she'd had since she was a baby. I'm mentioning that because later people asked if she'd changed before things started, like if she became withdrawn or angry or started talking about imaginary friends. She didn't. If anything, she was clingy in a normal way, the way younger siblings are when they think you're cooler than you are. Small things were easy to dismiss. The lights in the dining room would flicker, but the wiring in that house wasn't perfect. Dad said it was just loose connections, and he even opened the switch panel one weekend. I remember him kneeling there with a screwdriver while Elena hovered too close, and he kept telling her to step back. The flickering stopped for a few days after that, which felt like proof it had been nothing. Then it started again, but this time it wasn't just one room. The hallway light would blink on and off in a slow way, like someone was tapping the switch lightly. Our bedroom doors upstairs would be closed at night because my mom insisted on it. Something about privacy and airflow. I don't know. A few mornings in a row, mine would be open when I woke up. I assumed I'd left it open half asleep. Then Alina said hers had been open too, and she was pretty strict about closing it because she was afraid of the dark. I told her she probably forgot, but she got defensive about it, which wasn't like her. She said she remembered the click of the latch, and I remember thinking it was strange she'd pay attention to that detail. My mom started looking tired around that time. She would stand in the kitchen and just stare at the stove like she was trying to remember what she'd been about to cook. One afternoon I came home early because school was closed for some reason. I don't even remember. And she was sitting at the table with the phone in her hand, not dialing, just holding it. She said she'd heard footsteps upstairs while she was alone, walking from one end of the hall to the other. She'd gone up to check and nothing was out of place. Windows closed, no sign anyone had been there. Dad didn't like that kind of talk. He'd say houses make noises, wood expands, pipes shift. He was practical, and I think he felt like admitting something else might be happening would mean he'd failed to keep us safe. But when the kitchen cabinet door slammed shut on its own while all four of us were sitting at the table, even he went quiet. Hard enough to make the plates rattle. Alina flinched so badly she knocked over her glass of water. It was my mom who suggested having a priest come to bless the house. We're not extremely religious, but we grew up going to church on holidays and important days, so it didn't feel weird to call one. She contacted a local parish and a priest agreed to come by on a Saturday afternoon. I remember being embarrassed about it. Like, what if the neighbors saw and thought we were crazy? I stayed upstairs most of the time while he was there, but I could hear him murmuring prayers and moving from room to room. At first, his voice was steady, low, and he carried a small container of holy water that he flicked lightly against the walls. I leaned over the banister at one point and saw him in the living room, my mom standing stiffly behind him. Then they went upstairs. He stepped into my room first, then the bathroom and finally Alina's room at the end of the hall. I wasn't in there, but I was close enough to see his face when he came back out. He looked different. I don't mean scared. It's like someone had just told him something that didn't make sense. His skin had gone pale, and he wiped his forehead even though it wasn't hot. He asked my sister a few questions in a soft voice, things like if she'd been feeling unwell or having bad dreams. Alina just nodded and looked confused. When he reached the doorway to her room again, he hesitated. That's the part that stays with me. He didn't step back inside. Instead, he turned to my parents and said he would say one more prayer downstairs. He did, quickly, and then he packed up his things. My mom asked if everything was okay and he said, "Continue to pray. Keep the family close." He didn't finish the full blessing of the house. He left before sunset. That night is when things changed in a way that's harder to talk about. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud thud from the hallway. It wasn't like something falling. It was heavier. My door was open again and the hallway light was on, even though we turned it off before bed. I stepped out and saw Alina standing at the top of the stairs swaying slightly like she was sleepwalking. Her nightgown had dark stains on the front. It looked like blood. I rushed to her and grabbed her shoulders asking if she was hurt. She blinked at me slowly like she was trying to focus. When my mom came running up behind me, she gasped and pulled Alina into the bathroom. We checked her arms, her legs, her scalp. There was no cut, no scratch, not even dried blood on her skin. The stains were only on the fabric. Dad checked the stairs, the hallway, the bathroom floor thinking she'd fallen and hit something, but there was nothing. No source. I remember my hands shaking as I held the edge of the sink. I keep thinking maybe I missed something obvious, like maybe she'd had a nosebleed and wiped it away, but there was no blood on her face. And the stains were lower across her chest and stomach. We took her to the hospital anyway because she started complaining of stomach pain. By the time we got there she was feverish and quiet. They kept her overnight for observation. My parents stayed with her and I went back with my uncle who had come to help. I went upstairs to grab some clothes for my mom the next morning. Alina's room felt colder than the rest of the house. I know that sounds like I'm adding atmosphere, but I'm not. The window was closed. The air felt still. Her bed was unmade from the night before. The yellow blanket is half on the floor. I stepped inside and that's when I saw it. There was something sitting on the edge of her bed. It looked like a woman but distorted, like her face had been stretched in uneven directions. The mouth seemed wide and the eyes didn't line up properly. Like it was slightly blurred, but I knew it wasn't a shadow. It was darker than the room but also somehow separate from it. I froze. It turned its head toward me. The movement wasn't natural. It's like a video played at the wrong speed. I was feeling this deep, heavy pressure in my chest. Then it was gone. I even stepped closer to the bed, like maybe I could catch it doing something again. Eventually, I grabbed the clothes I came for and left the room, shutting the door behind me harder than I meant to. Alina was discharged 2 days later. The doctor said her fever had broken, and they couldn't find anything seriously wrong. She seemed tired but otherwise normal for about a week. Then she got sick again. This time it was worse. She woke up screaming about someone sitting on her bed. She said a woman was watching her sleep. My parents exchanged a look. They creeped me out. She developed bruises on her arms that doctors said might be from bumping into things, but they were in places that didn't make sense. I don't want to overstate that. They were clustered in a way that felt deliberate. My parents started looking for another house almost immediately. They didn't talk about it openly, but I could hear late-night conversations through the thin walls. We moved out within months. It felt rushed. We left some furniture behind because we couldn't sell it in time. Alina improved after we moved, gradually. The fever stopped. She slept through the night again. The bruises faded and didn't come back in that pattern. We didn't talk about the distorted woman. I tried once and my mom told me not to fill my head with things that weren't helpful. Dad said stress can make you see things. I've gone back past that old house a few times over the years. It's still standing but no one lives there. The yard is overgrown, windows boarded up now. I don't know if that's because of what happened, or just because the market is bad. I try not to make it into something symbolic. Houses get abandoned all the time. Alina is in her late 20s now. She doesn't remember much about that year. Just that she felt watched a lot. Sometimes she jokes about being the haunted child of the family, but it's light, like she's testing how serious it really was. The priest's face, when he stepped out of her room. The way he didn't finish, I replay that more than the figure itself because it feels more grounded, more real. A grown man deciding not to continue. Whatever was in that house, if it was something at all and not our minds playing tricks on us, seemed angry after that day. I don't have an explanation for the blood on her clothes or the thing I saw.